are making their way up here, I'll begin the introductions. To my immediate left is June Koppel-Dreyer, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Miami, and is also a Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. She's formerly the Chief Far East Specialist at the Library of Congress, a Commissioner of the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission, and Asia Advisor to Chief of Naval Operations, and the author of many books and articles on China, and as well as on Cross-Strait and China-Japan relations. So we're delighted to have her here. She also reminds me that we have spent a number of Taiwan elections together, kicking around Taipei and other parts, and it's always an interesting and rewarding experience. She also wins the prize for coming farthest among her group of panelists. The other two of my colleagues in the panel here are examples of the incredibly rich pool of talent of people who work on China issues, Taiwan issues, and East Asian issues in the New York area. We've had on these stages before. We've seen Terry Cohen, who after all is the president's advisor on his doctoral dissertation on the East China Sea issues. And Andy Nathan's been a colleague on these panels as well. And in the audience we have John Metzger and Peter Joel and Rory Rubenstein out there as well. So there's as much talent in the audience as there is on the stage. But equally impressive are my two New York area colleagues on this panel. James Xiong, who's been a professor at NYU since 1967. Hard to believe he doesn't look a day over 30. He is the author of 21 books in English, and even more than that, I think, in Chinese. Most recently, China into its Second Rise. He's written widely on China-related issues, Taiwan-related issues, and Hong Kong and other international relations topics that are germane to our discussion today. And last but far from least, Woj Wolf, who's a specialist on Chinese foreign policy, has written on China's energy security issues as well. And is quite knowledgeable about security questions in the region. He's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Rutgers, and once again, a seated fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and he has studied in Taiwan. So without further ado, let me get our discussion started here. I'm going to pose questions to the panelists and invite them to respond to the question and to one another. So I'll start with James with the first question. Professor Xiong, as we heard in the excerpt and as comes through in the full speech from President Ma, and as everyone in this room knows, a cross-strait rapprochement has been a real signature of Ma's presidency in the first term and into his second term. He emphasized it a great deal in his speech, and we all know about the many mileposts here, the passing of the crisis atmosphere of the Chen Shui-bian years, the creation of direct flights, the rise of tourism, the signing of ECFA and the 18 follow-on agreements, including on investment. Most recently, progress toward establishing almost consular-like offices on both sides of the strait. The pursuit of international space, WHA access, the diplomatic truce, on and on, quite a list. So I guess the question I put to you and to your colleagues here is that generally positive assessment of rapprochement correct? And what are the prospects, more importantly, going forward for Ma's strategy, which has been characterized by insisting on the 92 consensus on respective interpretations, the three no's, mutual non-recognition of sovereignty, mutual non-denial of governing authority, and the strategy we heard in the clip of taking pressing, easy, and economic issues followed by less pressing, difficult, and political issues. That's been a complex and largely successful strategy so far, but what do you think is going to happen going forward, and in particular, what are the concerns that Taiwan and the U.S. need to be worried about, or at least be mindful of in the coming months and years?
That's a loaded question. In the jargon of arms control, it's a MIRV question. Multiple individually targeted missile. Re-entry. By the very fact that two of the panelists are research fellows at the Euro Institute, I assume that being here myself today also qualifies me to be a next research associate at the Institute.
You can talk down.
Fine with me.
Okay, I'm glad you asked the question about the rapprochement. It was made possible. First, let me say it's a partial rapprochement because so far only economic relations, plus other things like travel and exchange of mail and so on. It hasn't got into the next phase yet, political rapprochement. and that is something yet to be done. Let me go back to the 九二共识, the 1992 consensus. I'm glad President Ma mentioned the mutual recognition of governing authority and non-recognition of sovereignty, because that came from a conversation I had with him before he took office in 2008. I even drew a written statement for him, and he said, he told me, 老师, you teach international law. I do. And he said, I'm also a graduate of the law school. So you and I both understand the complexity of these things from the legal point of view. But he said it's too complicated for the man in the street. And the next thing I knew was he changed the second part of my statement into non-repudiation or non-denial. I think he was very, very smart in doing so, which makes it more readily understandable to the layman. This is how it made things possible. Because until this 九二共识, this one China is a barrier in the sense that People's Republic thinks one China means the people PRC, and Taiwan thinks one China is the Republic of China ROC. But with this 九二共识, which means that there's a non-challenge, non-recognition of your claim to representing the entire China, including Taiwan, and nor our claim to, according to the ROC constitution, Taiwan still, the ROC still claims the rest of China and so on. So that thing is taken care of by the 1992 consensus. And this was possible only because of President Ma. I don't think anybody else could have done it because he had a legal training and he was able to do it. So the next step is how Taiwan and the mainland China can advance from the partial rapprochement to the next step into the political domain. So as far as I think the last question you asked is about the U.S., what U.S. should do, right? And so my favorite comment on that question is that I think the United States should continue the two things. One is that it's one China but not now policy, which began from the Shanghai communique. Secondly is to maintain equidistant policy toward both Taiwan and mainland China, because this way it will ease the apprehensions of mainland China that Taiwan is not going to be swallowed by the United States, and Taiwan will also feel secure that that the United States and China will not gang up on Taiwan. So this equidistant policy, I think, should be continued. But I think it should go further, should go beyond that. For example, in the current dispute between Japan and mainland China and Taiwan on the Gyeonggi Senkaku Island, and I think the United States should broker a peace talk, very much modeled after the six-party talk on Korea, because I think from both mainland China and Taiwan point of view, the United States is complicit in this dispute, because the U.S. was the one that turned over the Gyeonggi Island to the Japanese. And in fact, according to the wartime agreements and also the 1951 peace treaty with Japan, all territories and islands taken by Japan should be returned to their previous owners. And so instead of letting Gyeonggi Island to be returned to China, the United States turned that over along with the Ryukyus, which is now called Okinawa, to Japan. I think therefore, there's reason to say the United States is complicit in this current dispute. So I think the United States should be the one to broker a peace conference so that the two sides, Japan, or three of the sides, Japan, mainland China, and Taiwan, can talk it over, settle the question,
The United States agreed to turn, Japan agreed to turn over all of the territories that it seized in World War II and also under the Treaty of Shimonoseki. The Diaoyu Senkaku Islands were not part of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and therefore that they were not included in what the United States and Japan agreed to turn over. So the United States, therefore, is not complicit and does not have an obligation. It would be very nice if they wanted to, but I think that there is no legal obligation on the part of the United States. You can say there's some moral one, but there is not a legal one.
We can debate on that.
No, there is no debate about it. I'm sorry. The Diaoyu Senkaku were not a part of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and this is not a matter for debate. They're just not in there.
All right, well, we'll return to the East and South China Sea issues later in the meantime. I'll turn it to Woj so they can arm wrestle over who owns the islands. Do you want to weigh in on this issue?
Well, I think that the East China Sea issue is a part of the broader security picture in East Asia. And as someone who's been doing research on East Asian security for close to a decade now, it's very nice to hear about the U.S. pivot in Asia and the switch to American security policy focusing on Asia. It was those were dark, lean years with the war on terror looming over everything. But I think that that's partly comical relief, and I think it's also a realistic policy focus where if you simply look at the global map and you look at the financial focus of the world and the security focus, it all comes to East Asia. And what I tell my students who are in the audience is that by the time they're looking at their retirements, that slowly the center of power will have shifted over to East Asia, away from the Northern Hemisphere. So I think that these issues will be resolved, and also that the U.S. is making its initial steps back into the East Asian security focus.
Well, thank you all for that. On this first theme of what lies ahead in Cross-Strait relations, I think it's very easy and well-founded to have a fairly positive view based on how far we've come since 2008. That doesn't take a lot of thinking back to the controversy over the UN entry referendum and Lentavall and George W. Bush's fireside chat, where the president of the U.S. took the answer in the back of his hand, saying that he's the one endangering the Cross-Strait status quo. So from that baseline, it's been remarkable progress in terms of a sense of stability and some degree of rapprochement. I guess if one were to ask about the bumps ahead, it seems to be that some of them are built into the logic of the strategy, of President Ma's strategy of dealing with the relatively easy questions, the relatively pressing questions, the economic questions first, has been great as far as it's gone. But we have already seen for some time now talk from the mainland side about the importance of turning to political issues. And I would be surprised if that doesn't increase. Now, it's not to say it can't be managed. There are, I think, great commitments and interests on both sides to seeing orderly, gradual progress, but the possibility of some divergence in a sense of the appropriate pace that we've already seen signs of, and that's likely to continue. And while the pivot to Asia is an important response to power shifts in the region, of course, the dramatic power shift is across the strait in terms of the military imbalance between Taiwan and the mainland, moving inexorably in the obvious direction. And I think overlaid on that, one thing that a lot of people who watch China's foreign policy behavior have noted in the last few years is the tendency for Beijing to show signs of willingness to use economic power to political ends. So the threat of rare earth embargoes against Japan in the East China Sea disputes, the anger taken out in economic form against the Nobel Prize awarders to Liu Xiaobo, the Philippines issue last summer, where basically Philippine exports Japanese product sales in the Diaoyu Senkaku context. These are, I think, things that one needs to look out for. That said, I think there is still room for kicking the can down the road. We have the economic issues still playing out. We have cultural and educational issues in the interim, and certainly the most obvious political questions, such as addressing the sovereignty issue are still well over the horizon, and even a cross-strait peace accord has been, with President Ma's 3 conditions, been made something of short-term concern. Well, so we talked some about the U.S. pivot. We talked about, I just mentioned a bit about the cross-strait balance. The other piece of the story, as President Ma mentioned in his remarks about leadership transitions. Well, the biggest leadership transition in the region, of course, has been formally completed now in Beijing, with the Xi Jinping Li Keqiang leadership coming to power, and below the very top tier, a shuffling of foreign policy and Taiwan affairs leadership. So what does that mean, if anything, for prospects of cross-strait relations and the mainland's Taiwan policy? And I guess we could also fold into question the change that occurred late last year in some of the senior positions on the Taiwan side in dealing with these issues, including Jin Gusel coming to the U.S. as Taiwan's representative, Jason Yan, the former representative in Washington, going to the National Security Council, and a change in the head of the Mainland Affairs Council as well, away from the non-KMP Lai Ching-yuan to another, Mr. Wang, another advisor to President Ma. So, and those personnel changes on both sides of the strait, obviously not in the presidency on the ROC side, do those portend continuity change or anything we need to be concerned about in the short term or the next couple of years of cross-strait policies?
I'll let James or Jake talk about the Taiwan policy changes, but we know that this leadership transition in China was effected only after a massive internal power struggle, which resulted in one person who looked like a shoo-in for the Politburo Standing Committee being indicted, and his wife tried and convicted of murder of her British boyfriend, and then the party Congress itself being delayed for 6 weeks or so. And certain people, again, that we thought were going to end up in high positions, getting much lower positions. And Xi Jinping is the winner in this, at the head of this princely elitist faction, which has been, I don't know, I don't want to say historically in the context of China, because 5,000 years, it's really a very short period of time that this has been happening. But it seemed to clearly have the edge over the more populist faction, and what this means for future policy. But for what it means for cross-strait relations is that Xi Jinping has enemies. And if he looks too weak, the enemies are going to make him pay for it, and politically speaking. And he obviously knows this. And I think this has something to do with his praising a very controversial book, The China Dream. And it bodes for his not being able to take a too soft line toward cross-strait policy. And as Jacques indicated, the military balance is now way in favor of the People's Liberation Army and is liable to get more in future years. So at what point do we stop, particularly with the aggressive behavior in the South China Sea and the East China Sea toward Japan and various Southeast Asian nations? At what point is the People's Liberation Army going to say, all right, Deng Xiaoping gave good advice when he said, hide our capabilities and bide our time, but he didn't say we should do this forever, and now might be the time to move, because as Professor Wolf indicated, the shift of power gravity does seem to be going in the direction of not only Asia, but China particularly.
I agree with some of that. I think there is pressure for a more muscular foreign policy from Beijing. I think that's partly one of the many, many things that Hu Jintao was criticized for, was not pursuing a policy that was commensurate with China's newfound stature and status. And of course, you know, it's hard to win politically by being soft. There's always an incentive to be fairly firm on these issues. And I think particularly if you tie this in with what we see in the South and East China Sea, and concern about what I think is read as an anti-China pivot from the U.S. that pushes in that direction. That said, though, there have been pretty strong commitments to continuity. I mean, Hu Jintao on his way out, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang on their way in, have said all the right things about continuity in cross-strait policies, and I think they have good self-interested reasons for doing that. They've got a lot on their plate domestically and externally, and Taiwan policy is one of the few few bits of external relations, it seems to have gone pretty well, pretty satisfactorily over the last several years. So there's, I think, good reasons to keep it going. And I'd even suggest that PLA modernization has become less entangled with Taiwan scenarios. I mean, for a long time, the justification for the budget was the possibility of a conflict with the United States over Taiwan. The PLA's new toys are aircraft carriers and longer-range force protection capabilities, which don't have a lot to do with a cross-strait scenario. They're about situations in which, yes, Taiwan would be a factor if it were part of a U.S. bloc in a conflict with China, but many of the toys are really for a longer range.
Jacques, did you notice that the white paper, PLA's white paper issued yesterday, does speak about Taiwan independence as a reason? Admittedly, I don't see it happening, but it is interesting that they put that clause in the white paper.
No reason to give up or reason to get money.
On the issue of PLA militarization or military modernization, or to take a step back and look at this more broadly, I think